You probably think you know what happened at Nuremberg. 21 Nazis in the dock, justice delivered, case closed. The good guys won, the bad guys hanged, and history marched forward with a clear moral lesson about accountability and the rule of law. You're wrong. Not about the verdict. Not about the executions, but about what the trial actually was and what it cost to create justice from the ashes of civilization. Because here's what they don't tell you in history class: the architects of mass murder nearly walked free. Not because of clever lawyers or technicalities, but because Winston Churchill wanted them shot in the street without trial. Joseph Stalin wanted show trials followed by predetermined executions, and both men had compelling reasons to believe that was the right approach. What stopped them was one American bureaucrat who believed something radical, that the worst crimes in human history deserved better than mob justice. That documentation mattered more than expedience. That creating a legal precedent for the future was worth the risk of letting guilty men present a defense. His name was Henry Stimson. He was 78 years old, and he was about to convince the Allied powers to attempt something that had never been done: hold individuals accountable for crimes committed in the name of a state. The Nuremberg trials weren't inevitable. They were a gamble, and they almost failed. Before we reconstruct how the world's first international criminal tribunal came to exist, how it nearly collapsed under its own contradictions, and how its legacy shapes prosecutions of atrocities to this day, do me a favor. If you're finding this deep dive into one of history's most consequential legal proceedings valuable, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I genuinely want to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment telling me your location. Your engagement helps me create more content like this. Now, let's go back to the spring of 1945. The war in Europe ends on May 8th. By then, Allied forces have liberated concentration camps across Germany and Poland. Soldiers who survived D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge are walking through Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and they're vomiting. Not from weakness, from what they're seeing. Piles of corpses stacked like cordwood, survivors who weigh 70 pounds, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria still warm, lampshades made from human skin, mountains of children's shoes. Let me be more specific about what these soldiers encountered, because the abstraction of liberation doesn't capture the psychological devastation of witnessing industrialized death. At Dachau, American soldiers from the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions find 39 railway cars on a siding. Inside are approximately 2,000 corpses. The prisoners had been transported from Buchenwald as Allied forces approached. Most died during the journey from starvation, dehydration, or disease. Some were shot by guards. The bodies have been decomposing for days in the spring heat. Private First Class John Lee Archer, 22 years old, from Michigan, later writes in his diary, "The smell hit us 50 yards away, sweet and rotten at the same time, like meat left in the sun, but worse. So much worse. When we opened the first car, the bodies spilled out like they were stacked there deliberately, which they were, stacked like firewood. I turned away and vomited. Then I looked back because I needed to know this was real, that I wasn't hallucinating. 20 minutes later, I was still looking, still trying to understand how human beings did this to other human beings." At Buchenwald, liberated by the 80th Infantry Division on April 11th, the scene is different but equally horrific. The camp held approximately 21,000 prisoners when American forces arrived. Many are too weak to stand. Medical officers estimate that hundreds are dying daily despite liberation. their bodies too ravaged by starvation and disease to recover even with food and medical care. Captain Luther Smith, a medical officer, examines prisoners and writes in his report, "Patients present with extreme emaciation, average weight 60 to 80 pounds for adult males, prominent skeletal features, particularly ribs, pelvis and skull, skin lesions consistent with severe vitamin deficiency, edema in extremities, tuberculosis widespread, typhus epidemic in progress. Many patients have open wounds from beatings, untreated infections, evidence of torture." The psychological state of survivors is beyond my training to assess. Many are catatonic. Others speak compulsively about what they witnessed. Some don't seem to understand they've been liberated. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British forces on April 15th, conditions are catastrophic. The camp was designed to hold 10,000 prisoners. When British soldiers arrive, they find approximately 60,000 and approximately 13,000 unburied corpses scattered throughout the camp. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, commander of the 11th Light Field Ambulance Unit, describes the scene. "The living lay in huts among the dead. No one had the strength to move the corpses. People were dying around us at the rate of 500 per day. We had medical supplies, food, water, and for the first several days it made almost no difference. The infrastructure of life, sanitation, shelter, basic order, had completely collapsed. We were trying to resurrect the dead and many we couldn't save. British forces immediately requisition the nearby Wehrmacht training barracks and begin evacuating survivors. They burn the camp huts to stop the typhus epidemic. They use bulldozers to dig mass graves and push corpses into them because there's no other way to manage the scale of death. The soldiers operating the bulldozers are traumatized. One, a young corporal named Peter Coombs, later tells an interviewer, "I kept thinking about the people, that they had names, families, that they'd been children once. And I was pushing them into a pit with a machine. I knew it had to be done. That disease would spread if we didn't. But I felt like I was participating in the crime, like I was doing to them what the Nazis had done. It wasn't the same. I know it wasn't. But it felt wrong in my soul." The Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, orders every soldier in the vicinity to tour the camps. He orders photographers and film crews to document everything. He writes, "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he will know what he is fighting against." But Eisenhower also does something else. He invites members of Congress, journalists, and local German civilians to visit the camps. He wants witnesses. He wants documentation. He wants the world to see what was done in the name of the Third Reich. German civilians from nearby towns are marched through Buchenwald and Dachau. Many claim they didn't know what was happening in the camps. The evidence suggests otherwise. The crematoria smokestacks were visible for miles. The smell of burning bodies carried on the wind. Prisoners were used as slave labor in local factories, but the fiction of ignorance is widespread. When civilians tour Buchenwald, American soldiers force them to look at the corpses, the gas chambers, the ovens. Some weep, some vomit, some maintain stony silence. A few try to justify it, claiming the prisoners must have been criminals who deserved punishment. The soldiers don't respond well to that justification. Here's the problem. The Nazi leadership knows what's coming. Hitler commits suicide on April 30th in his Berlin bunker. Goebbels poisons his children and kills himself the next day. Himmler swallows cyanide after British forces capture him. Goering, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, surrenders to American forces, but he's carrying a cyanide capsule in his luggage. The Allies have corpses of victims but live prisoners of perpetrators. What do you do with the architects of industrialized genocide? This question becomes the subject of intense debate among the Allied leadership throughout May and June of 1945. The debate is not academic. It will determine whether the Nazi leadership faces summary execution or legal trial, and that choice will shape international law for the next 80 years. Churchill's answer is simple: shoot them, round up the Nazi leadership, confirm their identities, and execute them. No trial, no speeches, no platform for propaganda, just swift elimination of the guilty. Churchill is not advocating this position out of bloodlust. He's thinking strategically. He's concerned that a trial will allow Nazi defendants to grandstand, to spread propaganda, to claim victimhood. He's worried about the legal precedent. If you try Nazi leaders for crimes that weren't illegal under German law at the time they were committed, aren't you applying retroactive justice? And if the trial results in acquittals, won't that undermine Allied credibility and suggest the atrocity stories were exaggerated? In a memorandum to the War Cabinet dated May 11, 1945, Churchill writes, "The guilt of major war criminals is so black that they fall outside and go beyond the scope of judicial process. We should therefore proceed with their execution as a political act, not a legal one. History will understand that in the extremity of war, and in the face of crimes without precedent, summary justice was not only appropriate, but necessary." Stalin agrees with execution, but with a twist. He wants show trials, public proceedings where the verdict is predetermined, the punishment certain, and the purpose is political theater. This is the Soviet specialty. Stalin has already perfected the format in his purges of the 1930s. Stalin's position also isn't irrational. Soviet show trials serve multiple functions. They publicly humiliate enemies of the state, they demonstrate the state's power, they create propaganda value, and they provide a veneer of legality to political executions. Stalin sees no reason not to apply this formula to Nazi leaders. In conversations with Allied representatives, Stalin's position is clear. The Nazi leadership will be tried, convicted, and executed. The trial is theater, the outcome is predetermined. The only question is how elaborate the performance will be. Between these two positions stands Henry Stimson, the American Secretary of War. He's a Republican serving in a Democratic administration. He's been in government since the Taft administration. He helped create the legal framework for America's entry into World War I. He's seen enough of history to understand something both Churchill and Stalin are missing, that how you punish the guilty matters as much as whether you punish them. Stimson is not naive. He understands that the Nazi leadership is guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. He doesn't question whether they deserve execution, but he believes that summary execution, even of the clearly guilty, will create problems for the future. In a meeting at the Pentagon on May 26th, Stimson lays out his argument to Secretary of State James Burns, Attorney General Francis Biddle, and other senior officials. "Gentlemen," Stimson says, "I understand the appeal of swift justice. These men are monsters. The evidence of their crimes is overwhelming, but if we simply shoot them, what will history record? That the victors executed the vanquished, that might make right. That we were no better than they were, just more powerful." Biddle interjects, "Surely the camps provide all the justification needed. The evidence is irrefutable." "Today, yes," Stimson responds, "but what about 20 years from now, 50 years? When the witnesses are dead, when the evidence is disputed, when revisionists claim the atrocity stories were Allied propaganda. If we execute these men without trial, we give future generations room to doubt. We make martyrs of murderers." Someone points out that show trials, the Soviet approach, would provide documentation while still guaranteeing conviction. Stimson shakes his head. Predetermined verdicts are not justice. They're executions with extra steps, and the world will see through it. We'll be accused of victor's justice regardless of what we do. But if we conduct genuine trials with defense attorneys, evidentiary standards, the possibility of acquittal, we create something unprecedented. We establish that individuals are accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of what national laws permitted. We create a documentary record that will survive us. We demonstrate that law can prevail even in the aftermath of total war. The room is skeptical. Biddle raises the obvious concern: what if they're acquitted? What if clever lawyers exploit technicalities and the guilty walk free? Then we'll have demonstrated that our commitment to law is genuine, Stimson says. And the documentary evidence will remain. The trial will expose their crimes even if the verdict disappoints, but I don't believe acquittal is likely if we present the evidence properly. The Nazis documented their own crimes. We have their signatures on orders. We have their meeting minutes discussing genocide. We can convict them out of their own mouths. The debate continues for weeks. Stimson persists, and he has an ally. The new president, Harry Truman, who took office after Roosevelt's death in April. Truman is a former judge. He served as a county court judge in Missouri in the 1920s and 30s. He understands the value of legal precedent. He's also politically astute enough to see that a trial serves multiple purposes. It documents crimes for history, it establishes international law, and it gives the Allied coalition something to unite around while tensions between East and West already begin to fracture. By June of 1945, Truman decides there will be a trial. On June 6th, Truman meets with Stimson and Jackson at the White House. Jackson, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, has been asked to serve as chief prosecutor. Truman authorizes Jackson to negotiate with Allied powers to establish an international tribunal. "Mr. Justice," Truman says, "I'm sending you to do something that's never been done. Create law where none exists. Prosecute crimes that have no legal precedent. Convince 3 other nations to participate in a joint tribunal with shared authority. And do it in a way that history will recognize as genuine justice, not victor's vengeance." Jackson responds, "Mr. President, I believe the crimes speak for themselves. Our task is to let the evidence be heard. If we do that fairly, the verdicts will be just." "See that it's done," Truman says, "and Justice Jackson, the world is watching. Make sure we're worthy of its judgment." Now the Allies face a different problem. They've agreed to prosecute Nazi leadership in a court of law. But what court? What law? And who decides the charges? There is no international criminal court. There is no body of international criminal law that applies to individuals rather than states. The concept of war crimes exists. The Hague Conventions outline rules of warfare, but prosecuting leaders for crimes committed within their own borders against their own citizens, that's uncharted territory. The Allies convene meetings in London during the summer of 1945 to create the legal framework. 4 nations send representatives: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. They need to agree on 3 fundamental questions. The meetings are contentious. The negotiators are operating under political pressure from their governments, personal convictions about justice, and practical concerns about creating workable legal procedures. The American delegation is led by Robert Jackson. He's accompanied by legal experts from the State Department and War Department. Jackson's position is idealistic: create genuine international law that applies universally, not just to defeated enemies. The British delegation is led by Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, the Attorney General. He's more pragmatic than Jackson. He wants a tribunal that satisfies Churchill's demand for swift justice while providing enough legal legitimacy to withstand historical scrutiny. The French delegation, led by Professor André Gros, is focused on ensuring French participation and documenting Nazi crimes against France. France was occupied, humiliated, partially complicit through Vichy collaboration. The French need this trial to reassert national dignity. The Soviet delegation, led by General Iona Nikitchenko, operates under direct instructions from Stalin. Their mandate is clear: ensure convictions, maintain Soviet control over proceedings related to Eastern Front crimes, and avoid any examination of Soviet conduct. The first major disagreement emerges immediately. What are the charges? Jackson proposes 4 counts. Count 1, conspiracy to commit crimes. Count 2, crimes against peace, meaning planning and waging aggressive war. Count 3, war crimes, meaning violations of the established laws of warfare. And Count 4, crimes against humanity. The Soviets object to Count 1. Nikitchenko argues that conspiracy is an Anglo-American legal concept that doesn't exist in Soviet or continental law. He insists that the tribunal should only prosecute concrete acts, not abstract conspiracies. Jackson responds, the Nazi regime didn't commit isolated crimes. It was a criminal enterprise from its inception. The conspiracy charge allows us to establish that aggressive war and genocide were not mistakes or excesses, but planned policy. Without this charge, we can't demonstrate the systematic nature of Nazi criminality. The debate goes back and forth. Eventually a compromise emerges. Conspiracy will be charged, but it will be defined narrowly to focus on specific plans for aggressive war rather than broad ideological agreement with Nazi goals. The second disagreement concerns Count 4, crimes against humanity. This is the revolutionary charge. It's created specifically for this tribunal. Crimes against humanity means atrocities committed against civilians, mass murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, persecution on political, racial, or religious grounds. It's the legal category that allows prosecution of the Holocaust. Maxwell Fyfe raises the obvious problem. This law didn't exist when the crimes were committed. We're applying retroactive justice. How do we defend that? Jackson has an answer. The law against murder existed. The law against torture existed. What didn't exist was international jurisdiction to prosecute these crimes when committed by a government against its own people. We're not creating new crimes. We're creating new jurisdiction. The acts were always criminal. We're establishing that sovereignty doesn't protect perpetrators from prosecution. Professor Gross adds, the Hague Conventions established that certain acts are crimes regardless of whether national law permits them. We're extending that principle to crimes against civilian populations. It's an evolution of existing law, not creation of new law. The Soviets support crimes against humanity enthusiastically. It allows prosecution of Nazi atrocities in occupied territories without examining whether Soviet conduct in those same territories was comparable. The charge is adopted. Crimes against humanity becomes part of international law because 4 nations negotiating in London in the summer of 1945 decide it should exist. Second question, where do you hold the trial? Stalin wants Berlin. It's the capital of the defeated Reich. Soviet forces captured it. The symbolism is perfect, plus locating the trial in the Soviet occupation zone gives Stalin home field advantage. The Western Allies refuse. They don't trust Soviet administration. They're uncomfortable giving Stalin control of the venue. And practically, Berlin is rubble. The city is divided into occupation zones. The infrastructure barely exists. Someone suggests Nuremberg. It's symbolic for different reasons. This is where the Nazi Party held its massive rallies, where Hitler's architect Albert Speer built the parade grounds, where the Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship. The city also has a mostly intact palace of justice with a large courtroom and an attached prison, practical and symbolic. The Soviets object. Nuremberg is in the American occupation zone. They want Berlin or nothing. Jackson proposes a compromise, Nuremberg as the trial location, but with the tribunal's official seat being Berlin. The actual proceedings happen in Nuremberg, but symbolically the tribunal represents justice in the conquered capital. After days of negotiation, the Soviets agree. The trial will be in Nuremberg, but Berlin will be designated as the permanent seat of the tribunal. Third question, who stands trial? The obvious candidates are the Nazi leadership, but most of them are dead. Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, all suicides. So the Allies cast a wider net. They identify 24 individuals who represent different aspects of Nazi criminality: military leaders, government ministers, propagandists, industrialists, ideologues. The list is political. Each Allied nation wants specific defendants prosecuted. The Soviets insist on including military leaders responsible for Eastern Front atrocities. The French want officials who administered occupied France. The Americans want economic planners and industrialists who financed rearmament. The British want the diplomatic and propaganda apparatus. Compromises are made. Gustav Krupp, the arms manufacturer, is included to satisfy American demands for industrialist prosecution, even though he's senile and bedridden. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary, is missing and presumed dead, but included anyway, to demonstrate the scope of the conspiracy. The indictments are served in October of 1945. 24 names, but only 21 will stand trial. Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front, hangs himself in his cell before the proceedings begin. Gustav Krupp is deemed medically unfit. He's senile and bedridden. Martin Bormann is missing and will be tried in absentia. That leaves 21 men in the dock when the trial opens on November 20th, 1945. Let me describe that courtroom to you, because understanding the physical space helps you understand the power dynamics. The Palace of Justice is a neo-Renaissance building, all stone and dignity, damaged but standing. The exterior shows pockmarks from shrapnel and bullet strikes. Some windows are boarded up. The building sits in a city that's approximately 90% destroyed by Allied bombing. Around the courthouse, Nuremberg is rubble. Entire neighborhoods are flattened. The medieval city center is gone. The Nazi parade grounds where Hitler held rallies are damaged and abandoned. But the Palace of Justice is functional. American occupation forces spent months repairing it. They reinforced the prison wing. They renovated the courtroom. They installed the technological systems that will make a multilingual trial possible. The courtroom itself is not particularly large, maybe 60 feet by 40 feet. At one end, elevated, sit the judges, 4 of them, one from each Allied nation. Their bench is draped with Allied flags: American, British, French, Soviet. Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence from Britain presides. He's 57 years old, a career jurist known for fairness and efficiency. He's chosen because of his reputation for managing complex proceedings without grandstanding. He speaks softly, rarely raises his voice, and keeps the trial moving forward through sheer competence. Next to him, Francis Biddle from the United States, a former Attorney General. Biddle is politically connected. He served in Roosevelt's cabinet, but he's also a serious legal mind. He's been warned by Truman that the trial must be scrupulously fair. Biddle takes this seriously. Henri Donnedieu de Vabre from France, a professor of international law. De Vabre is the intellectual on the bench. He's written extensively about criminal law theory. He sees the trial as an opportunity to establish legal principles that will outlast the specific verdicts. And Iona Nikitchenko from the Soviet Union, a major general who participated in Stalin's show trials of the 1930s. Yes, a man who helped orchestrate political executions will now sit in judgment of Nazi atrocities. The irony is not lost on anyone. Nikitchenko is not a neutral jurist. He's a Soviet officer following Stalin's directives. He's been told to ensure convictions, prevent criticism of Soviet conduct, and represent Soviet interests. He does exactly that. Below the judges at floor level sit the prosecutors. The American team is led by Robert Jackson, an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He took leave from the highest court in America to serve as chief prosecutor. Jackson is eloquent, idealistic, and convinced that this trial will establish principles that outlast the war. He's about to be proven right, but not before he's humiliated in front of the world. Jackson is supported by a team of American lawyers, researchers, and translators. They've spent months sorting through captured Nazi documents. They've identified evidence, organized exhibits, prepared witnesses. They believe they have an airtight case. The British prosecution is led by Sir Hartley Shawcross, the Attorney General. Shawcross is a skilled courtroom lawyer with political ambitions. He's effective, ruthless when necessary, and less idealistic than Jackson. The French prosecution is led by François de Menthon, a former resistance fighter. For de Menthon, this isn't just legal work, it's personal. He fought against Nazi occupation. He lost friends to Gestapo torture. He sees the trial as vindication for those who resisted. The Soviet prosecution is led by Roman Rudenko, a Soviet prosecutor experienced in political trials. Rudenko's job is to present evidence of Nazi crimes in the Soviet Union while avoiding any suggestion that Soviet forces committed comparable atrocities. Opposite the prosecutors are the defendants. They sit in 2 rows of wooden benches guarded by American military police wearing white helmets and polished boots. The guards are armed. They stand at attention behind the defendants throughout the proceedings. The message is clear: these men are prisoners, not dignitaries. The defendants wear civilian clothes, no uniforms. They're stripped of rank and insignia, but some still carry themselves with military bearing. In the front row, on the far left, sits Hermann Göring. If Hitler was the ideological core of Nazism, Göring was its operational engine. Reichsmarschall, commander of the Luftwaffe, second in line to lead the Reich, founder of the Gestapo, architect of the 4-year plan that prepared Germany for war, and a morphine addict who has spent the last several months in American custody detoxing. Göring is 42 years old. He's lost weight during detoxification, down from 280 pounds to 200. He's clear-eyed for the first time in years. He's wearing a grey double-breasted suit that hangs loose on his reduced frame. He's been allowed to keep his Iron Cross medals, which he wears prominently. Göring has decided that his role in this trial is to defend not just himself but the honor of Nazi Germany and the memory of Adolf Hitler. He speaks to the other defendants during breaks, encourages them to resist, mocks the proceedings. He's the dominant personality among the prisoners. Next to Göring sits Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, who flew solo to Scotland in 1941 in a bizarre attempt to negotiate peace, and has been in British custody ever since. Hess claims amnesia. He reads magazines during testimony. His mental state is genuinely questionable, but he's declared competent to stand trial. Hess is thin, gaunt, with sunken eyes. He seems disconnected from the proceedings. Sometimes he laughs at inappropriate moments, other times he appears catatonic. The psychiatrists examining him can't agree whether he's genuinely impaired or malingering. Behind them are the others. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, who negotiated the non-aggression pact with Stalin that let Germany invade Poland. Ribbentrop is nervous, twitchy. He was a champagne salesman before joining the Nazi Party. He rose through personal loyalty to Hitler, not competence. Now facing trial, he looks lost. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, who signed orders for mass executions. Keitel sits ramrod straight, military bearing intact. He's 63 years old, a career soldier. He maintains that he was following Hitler's orders, that a soldier's duty is obedience. He doesn't seem to understand that this defense won't work. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to survive the war, who oversaw the system of concentration camps. Kaltenbrunner is enormous, 6'7", scarred face, intimidating physical presence. He claims he was only nominally in charge of camp administration, that he didn't know about extermination programs. The documentary evidence will prove otherwise. Alfred Rosenberg, the racial theorist who provided the intellectual foundation for genocide. Rosenberg is the ideologue. He wrote the books that justified Aryan supremacy and Jewish extermination. He seems genuinely convinced of his theories. He shows no remorse. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, who oversaw the destruction of Polish Jewry. Frank is different from the others. He's brought his diaries to the trial, 38 volumes documenting his administration of occupied Poland. He seems to want the trial to happen, to want the truth exposed. It's unclear whether this is genuine contrition or psychological breakdown. And near the end, Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and armaments minister. Speer is 30 years old. He's handsome, educated, cultured. He looks like he belongs at a university, not a war crimes trial. He will be the only defendant to express something resembling remorse. He will also lie systematically about what he knew and when he knew it. Around the room, filling every available space, are journalists. More than 200 of them from newspapers around the world. This is the most covered trial in history to this point. There are film cameras recording everything, newsreel cameras in fixed positions, operated continuously throughout the proceedings. The press gallery includes major figures. John Dos Passos, the American novelist, is covering the trial. Rebecca West, the British writer, sends dispatches. Walter Cronkite, a young United Press correspondent, reports from Nuremberg. The Soviet press is represented by official journalists who file reports that Moscow censors heavily. The journalists sit at wooden tables with notebooks and typewriters. They have access to daily transcripts. They can interview prosecutors and defense attorneys. They cannot speak with defendants except through official channels. And there's something else, a technological innovation that makes the whole proceeding possible. The trial is conducted in 4 languages: English, French, German, and Russian. Simultaneous interpretation hasn't been done before on this scale. The technology is invented specifically for Nuremberg. IBM engineers have rigged a system where interpreters sit in glass booths at the back of the courtroom. Each booth contains interpreters for one language. They wear headphones to hear the proceedings and speak into microphones. Their translations are broadcast on separate channels. Everyone in the courtroom wears headphones: judges, lawyers, defendants, journalists. A dial on the headphone cord lets you select your language: English, French, German, or Russian. The interpreters translate in real time, speaking over the original speaker. It's clunky. The system breaks down frequently. Interpreters struggle with legal terminology, technical language, and speakers who talk too fast. Sometimes they fall behind and have to summarize rather than translate word for word. Sometimes they mistranslate critically, creating confusion. But it works well enough. Without this system, the trial couldn't happen. You can't conduct multilingual proceedings through consecutive translation. It would take 4 times as long and lose all dramatic impact. On the morning of November 20th, 1945, Lord Justice Lawrence calls the court to order. The courtroom rises, the judges take their seats, the defendants are brought in under guard and seated. Lawrence speaks in English, his words translated simultaneously into French, German, and Russian. The trial, which is now about to begin, is unique in the history of jurisprudence. It is the first time that an international tribunal has been established to try individuals accused of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He continues, the defendants are entitled to full legal representation, to cross-examine witnesses and to present evidence in their defense. They are presumed innocent until proven guilty. The tribunal will conduct these proceedings according to the highest standards of justice. It's a remarkable statement. The chief judge of an international tribunal prosecuting Nazi war criminals is announcing that those defendants have full legal rights, that they're presumed innocent, that the trial will be fair. Some defendants look skeptical. Göring smirks. Others seem relieved. At least their lawyers will be allowed to mount a defense. Robert Jackson stands to deliver the opening statement for the prosecution, and he gives one of the great speeches in legal history. The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it could not survive their being repeated. Jackson's voice is clear, deliberate. He's not shouting, he's not theatrical. He's speaking as if addressing the ages, not just the courtroom, that four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law, is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. This is Jackson's central argument, that the trial itself, regardless of verdicts, demonstrates that law can prevail over revenge, that powerful nations can choose legal process over summary execution. He continues, the defendants before you are not figments of propaganda or creatures of ideology. They are men who made choices, who gave orders, who signed documents, who authorized atrocities, and men who must now answer for those choices. Jackson speaks for the United States, but he positions the trial as larger than national interest. He's arguing that individual human beings, not just abstract states, can be held accountable for violations of fundamental human rights. He's trying to create international criminal law out of whole cloth while the defendants watch. We will show you the Nazi regime's own documents, their meeting minutes, their orders, their budget reports, their kill statistics. We will convict these defendants out of their own mouths, using their own words, their own signatures, their own admissions. This is Jackson's strategy, and it's brilliant. He's not going to rely primarily on witness testimony. Witnesses can be dismissed as biased or unreliable. Instead, Jackson will use captured Nazi documents to prove the charges. Paper signed by defendants, official correspondence, bureaucratic records of genocide. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. It's stirring, it's principled, and it contains the seeds of the trial's central vulnerability. If this is victor's justice, if the Allied powers are imposing retroactive law on defeated enemies, then how is this different from the show trials they're condemning? Jackson has an answer, but delivering it will require months of evidence presentation. For now, he concludes his opening statement and sits down. The courtroom is silent for a moment. Then Lawrence calls the first evidentiary presentation. And the trial begins in earnest. The prosecution doesn't start with witnesses, they start with documents, boxes and boxes of captured Nazi records. The prosecutors have organized them into categories: documents proving the conspiracy to wage aggressive war, documents proving war crimes, documents proving crimes against humanity. The Allies have documents, tons of them, literally. When Germany collapsed, retreating Nazi officials tried to destroy records, but they didn't have time. The Wehrmacht was meticulous about documentation. The SS kept detailed records. The Nazi bureaucracy generated paperwork for everything, including genocide. Allied forces captured archives, 3,000 tons of Nazi documents. Jackson's team has sorted through this paper mountain. They've identified roughly 4,000 documents to present as exhibits. Orders signed by defendants. Meeting minutes. Correspondence. Budget reports for concentration camps. Deportation schedules. Kill statistics submitted by SS units. The Nazis documented their own crimes in triplicate. The first document presented is the Hossbach Memorandum, minutes from a meeting on November 5, 1937, where Hitler told his military commanders that Germany would seize territory in Eastern Europe through aggressive war. The memo proves premeditation. It shows that Nazi aggression wasn't defensive or reactive. It was planned years in advance. The prosecution reads the memo aloud. The defendants listen through headphones as the translation comes through. Some take notes. Some maintain poker faces. Göring leans back in his chair, arms folded as if bored. Document after document is presented. The prosecution establishes a chronological narrative. The Nazi conspiracy begins with Hitler's rise to power, continues through rearmament and territorial expansion, accelerates with the invasion of Poland, and culminates in total war and genocide. The defendants' lawyers object frequently. They challenge the authenticity of documents. They argue that meeting minutes don't prove individual knowledge or responsibility. They claim that their clients were unaware of criminal policies. The prosecution counters with documents signed by the defendants themselves, orders bearing Keitel's signature, authorizing mass executions of partisans, correspondence from Ribbentrop, coordinating deportations with Allied governments, meeting notes showing Göring's participation in planning aggressive war. The documentary phase is tedious but devastating. Day after day, week after week, the prosecution presents evidence. The journalists in the press gallery struggle to stay engaged. Reading bureaucratic documents aloud isn't dramatic, but the cumulative effect is overwhelming. The Nazi regime's criminality is proven not through emotional testimony, but through its own paperwork. This is Jackson's ace. He doesn't need survivors to tell horror stories that defendants can dismiss. He has the defendants' signatures on the orders that authorized horror. But here's what Jackson doesn't anticipate. Hermann Göring is going to fight back. The trial proceeds methodically through November and December of 1945. The prosecution presents evidence, witnesses testify, documents are submitted. The first major witnesses are military officers who describe the planning and execution of aggressive war. General Erwin Lahausen, a former Wehrmacht intelligence officer, testifies about orders to execute Polish intellectuals and Jews during the invasion of Poland. He identifies documents. He describes meetings where these policies were discussed. Under cross-examination by Göring's lawyer, Lahausen is asked, "Did Reichsmarshal Göring personally order these executions?" "Not directly," Lahausen admits. "The orders came through military channels from the High Command. So you cannot definitively state that my client authorized these specific acts. I can state that the policy was discussed at the highest levels of leadership, including Reichsmarshal Göring. The systematic nature of the killings proves this wasn't unauthorized violence by individual soldiers. It was organized policy. The defense is trying to create distance between the defendants and the crimes. They argue that Hitler gave orders, that the defendants were subordinates following directives, that individual culpability can't be proven. The prosecution counters by showing how Nazi governance worked. There wasn't always a direct order from Hitler. The regime operated through what historians later call working towards the Führer. Subordinates anticipated Hitler's wishes and implemented policies without explicit orders. The defendants weren't passive recipients of commands, they were active participants in a criminal enterprise. Then, on November 29th, the Americans screen a film. The film is called Nazi Concentration Camps. It's a compilation of footage shot by Allied forces as they liberated camps in April and May of 1945. The footage is raw, unedited, unsanitized. The courtroom is darkened. Heavy curtains are drawn across the windows. The projection screen is set up facing the defendants, so they're forced to watch. The lights go down. The projector starts. You see piles of corpses, not bodies arranged for burial, corpses stacked in open pits and warehouses, skeletal, rotting. You see survivors who can barely stand, their bones visible through translucent skin. You see Allied soldiers using bulldozers to push bodies into mass graves because there's no other way to handle the volume of dead. You see the gas chambers at Dachau, rooms disguised as showers, with pipes that delivered Zyklon B instead of water. You see the ovens at Buchenwald still containing partially burned remains. You see experimental medical equipment used by doctors who treated prisoners as laboratory animals. The camera lingers on details, a pile of eyeglasses, thousands of them taken from prisoners before they were killed, a warehouse full of human hair, shorn from corpses and collected for industrial use, children's shoes in enormous piles. The film includes testimony from American soldiers who liberated the camps. They speak directly to the camera, describing what they found. Some break down while speaking. One soldier says simply, "I don't have words for this. No one will believe it unless they see it themselves." The film shows German civilians being marched through the camps by Allied soldiers. The civilians react with horror. Some weep, some vomit, some turn away, and are forced by soldiers to keep looking. An American officer addresses a group of German civilians. "You will say you didn't know, but the crematorium chimneys were visible from your homes, the smell carried on the wind, prisoners worked in your factories. You knew." The film runs for an hour. In the darkened courtroom, the only sounds are the projector's mechanical whir and occasional gasps from spectators. Some defendants watch, some turn away, some cover their eyes. Guards tell them to watch. Lawrence doesn't intervene. He allows the defendants to avert their eyes if they choose, but the guards' presence ensures they can't entirely avoid the images. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, watches the entire film. Witnesses report tears on his face. At one point he whispers to the guard behind him, "My God, what have we done?" Göring folds his arms and stares at the screen without expression. He watches impassively, as if the film shows abstract images rather than consequences of policies he helped create. Hess reads a magazine, apparently uninterested. Whether this is genuine dissociation or performance is unclear. Ribbentrop watches with his hand over his mouth, looking physically ill. At several points he closes his eyes for extended periods. Speer watches carefully, his face showing distress. Later he'll claim this was the first time he fully understood the scope of Nazi atrocities. This claim is false. He knew about the camps, visited them, selected prisoners for slave labor, but his performance during the film screening supports his narrative of the remorseful technocrat. When the lights come back up, the courtroom is silent. No one speaks for several seconds. The judges look shaken. The prosecutors are grim-faced. The defense attorneys look stunned. One of the prosecutors, a U.S. Navy commander named James Donovan, presents the film as evidence. He says simply, "The defense has argued that crimes against humanity cannot be proven through documentation alone, that witnesses may be unreliable, that without direct orders from defendants, individual culpability cannot be established. The film you have just seen shows the consequences of the policies these men created. The documentary evidence proves they created those policies. The connection is irrefutable." Defense attorney Dr. Otto Stamer stands and objects. The film is prejudicial. It is designed to inflame emotion rather than establish legal facts. There is no evidence linking my client specifically to the conditions shown in that film. Stamer represents Göring. He's a competent lawyer, politically conservative, willing to defend an unpopular client because he believes in legal representation. He knows the objection will fail, but he's creating a record. Lord Justice Lawrence responds, "The objection is noted. The tribunal finds the film admissible as evidence of the consequences of policies charged in the indictment. The prosecution must still prove individual defendant responsibility for those policies through specific evidence." The objection fails. The film is admitted. This screening breaks something in the trial's emotional architecture. Up until this point, the proceedings have been abstract. Legal arguments, document exhibits, technical testimony. Now the courtroom has been forced to witness the consequences of the policy decisions these men made. But the film also creates a problem. It's visceral, emotional, shocking. It's not legal evidence in the traditional sense. It doesn't directly link individual defendants to specific crimes. Defense attorneys continue to argue that the film is prejudicial, designed to inflame rather than inform. The judges allow the film, and the prosecution moves forward with its case, now building toward confrontations with individual defendants. By early 1946, the prosecution is building toward its confrontation with the most dangerous defendant, Hermann Göring. Göring is not like the others. Some of the men in the dock are bureaucrats who signed papers. Some are ideologues who wrote pamphlets. Some are soldiers who followed orders. Göring was all of these things and more. He was a political operator, a military commander, an economic planner, and Hitler's designated successor. More than that, Göring is smart, charismatic, and clear-headed for the first time in years after his forced detoxification. He's decided that his defense will not be to deny his actions but to justify them. He will argue that everything he did was in service of Germany, that the Allies are hypocrites prosecuting crimes they also committed, and that history will vindicate National Socialism. During the weeks leading up to his testimony, Göring holds court among the other defendants during breaks. The prisoners are allowed to exercise together in a courtyard for 1 hour daily. During these exercise periods, Göring walks among the others, offering encouragement, advice, and strategic guidance. To Ribbentrop, who's nervous and unfocused, "Stop apologizing. You represented German interests through diplomatic means. There's no crime in that." To Speer, who's been expressing remorse, "You're making a mistake. Contrition won't save you. It just validates their narrative. Defend what we built." To the military officers, Keitel, Jodl, Dönitz, "You were soldiers. Soldiers follow orders. That's not criminal. That's duty." The American guards observe these conversations but don't intervene. The prisoners are allowed to speak among themselves. Göring's influence is clear. He's the dominant personality, still exercising leadership even in captivity. The prison psychologist, Captain Gustav Gilbert, has regular access to the defendants. He interviews them, assesses their mental states, and keeps detailed notes. Gilbert observes Göring's behavior and writes, "Göring has assumed leadership of the defendants as if it's his natural right. The others defer to him, seek his approval, follow his strategic guidance. He's running a defense strategy for the group, not just himself. His goal is clear: defend the Nazi regime's honor, portray Allied prosecution as hypocrisy, and ensure history remembers Nazi Germany as a legitimate state destroyed by superior force, not a criminal enterprise justly punished." In March of 1946, Göring takes the stand. The courtroom is packed. Journalists fill every seat in the press gallery. Spectators include Allied officers, German citizens selected by lottery, and representatives from liberated nations. Everyone wants to see Göring testify. Göring is sworn in. He sits in the witness box, wearing his grey suit, Iron Cross visible. He looks directly at the judges, not at the prosecutors. His bearing is confident. His own attorney, Dr. Stamer, conducts the initial examination. This is strategic. Stamer will let Göring tell his story before the prosecutors attack. Stamer asks, "Reichsmarshal Göring, please describe your role in the National Socialist government." Göring responds in German. His words translated simultaneously. "I was a loyal servant of Germany and Adolf Hitler. Everything I did was in service of restoring German dignity after the humiliation of Versailles." He speaks for hours. He describes his background: a fighter pilot ace in World War I, decorated for bravery, unemployed and disillusioned in the Weimar Republic. He describes meeting Hitler, joining the Nazi Party, believing that National Socialism offered Germany a path to recovery. He describes the Nazi rise to power as a response to legitimate grievances. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of territory and imposed crushing reparations. The Weimar government was weak, ineffective, plagued by political violence. The communist threat was real. Hitler offered strength, order, national renewal. Goering doesn't deny his actions. He admits building the Luftwaffe. He admits preparing Germany for war. He admits creating the Gestapo. But he frames everything as defensive necessity, not aggressive criminality. The Versailles Treaty was designed to keep Germany weak forever. Goering testifies, "We had the right to rearm, to reclaim lost territory, to defend ourselves against hostile neighbors. What nation wouldn't do the same?" Starmer guides him through the charges systematically. On the charge of conspiracy to wage aggressive war, Goering argues that German military planning was defensive, that Allied powers were also preparing for war, that Germany simply acted first. On war crimes, Goering admits that excesses occurred but claims they were unauthorized actions by subordinates, not official policy. On crimes against humanity, Goering's strategy shifts. He admits that harsh measures were taken against enemies of the state, but frames them as security necessities during wartime. He doesn't deny the concentration camps, the evidence is too overwhelming, but he claims they were primarily labor facilities, that deaths resulted from wartime shortages and disease rather than deliberate extermination. This is a lie. Goering knows it's a lie. Everyone in the courtroom knows it's a lie, but Goering is playing to history, not to the judges. He's creating a narrative that future sympathizers can use. He testifies for days. He speaks clearly, confidently, without notes. He describes the rise of the Nazi Party as a response to the humiliation of Versailles, the chaos of the Weimar Republic, the threat of communism. He portrays Hitler as a visionary who restored German dignity and prosperity. He admits his role in building the military and preparing for war, but frames it as defensive necessity. The judges allow him to speak at length. They're giving him enough rope to hang himself or to make his case. The transcript shows Lawrence occasionally trying to keep Goering focused on specific questions, but mostly allowing him to narrate. And then Robert Jackson cross-examines him. This is the moment Jackson has been building toward, the chief American prosecutor against the most senior Nazi defendant, the confrontation that will demonstrate whether Victor's justice can also be real justice. It goes badly. Jackson approaches the cross-examination with a clear strategy. Get Goering to admit culpability through his own statements. He presents quotes from Goering's speeches, excerpts from his orders, documents bearing his signature. The goal is to trap Goering in contradictions, to force him to either deny his own words or admit criminality. But Goering doesn't cooperate. He's a skilled debater, and he's playing to win. Jackson's first question: "You signed orders authorizing the use of concentration camps for political prisoners, did you not?" Goering: "I established the first camps in Prussia in 1933, yes. They were temporary facilities for individuals who posed a threat to state security during the revolutionary period." Jackson: "And these facilities held prisoners without trial, without legal process?" Goering: "In extraordinary times, extraordinary measures are necessary. Every nation has the right to protect itself from internal enemies." Jackson tries to establish that the camps were criminal from their inception. Goering deflects, arguing that protective custody during political upheaval was legitimate state action. Jackson shifts strategy. "You signed orders in 1941 authorizing Reinhard Heydrich to prepare the final solution to the Jewish question, did you not?" Goering: "I signed many orders. You'll have to be more specific about the document you're referencing." Jackson presents a document, a directive from July 1941 bearing Göring's signature, instructing Heydrich to make preparations for a total solution of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Göring: that document concerns emigration and resettlement, not extermination. Jackson: emigration to where? Death camps? Göring: I had no knowledge of extermination programs. That was Himmler's area of responsibility. This is a calculated lie. Göring attended meetings where the Jewish question was discussed explicitly in terms of extermination, but Jackson can't prove Göring's subjective knowledge unless he has a document where Göring explicitly acknowledges awareness of killing programs. Jackson grows frustrated. He presents more documents. Göring deflects or provides alternative interpretations. Jackson tries to cut him off, to keep him focused on yes or no answers. Göring refuses to be contained. At one point, Jackson asks, "You admit that aggressive war is criminal under international law?" Göring: I admit no such thing. Defensive war is lawful. Whether a war is aggressive or defensive is a political judgment, not a legal one. Jackson: so you deny that Germany waged aggressive war against Poland, Norway, France, the Soviet Union? Göring: Germany acted to defend its security interests against hostile powers. I don't accept your characterization of those actions as criminal. The exchange becomes heated. Jackson's voice rises. Göring remains calm, almost amused. At one point, Jackson snaps, "You're evading the question." Göring responds smoothly, "I'm answering honestly." Perhaps the question itself is imprecise. Lord Justice Lawrence intervenes. "Mr. Justice Jackson, please proceed with specific questions. The witness will answer directly." But Göring continues to give long, discursive answers. He's playing for time, controlling the narrative, refusing to be cornered. The cross-examination continues for 3 days. Jackson becomes visibly frustrated. He's a Supreme Court justice, accustomed to deference and competent advocacy. Göring is neither deferential nor cooperative. The press gallery notices. Journalists write that Jackson is losing control, that Göring is dominating the exchange, that the chief prosecutor looks outmatched. One American reporter writes, "Göring has turned the witness stand into a podium. Jackson came armed with documents and legal theory. Göring came armed with charisma and shamelessness. In a contest between facts and performance, performance is winning." And here's the thing, Göring is winning the cross-examination, but he's losing the trial, because Jackson's documentary evidence doesn't care about courtroom performance. The documents prove Göring's signature on orders for mass murder. The testimony of concentration camp commandants proves those orders were carried out. Göring can dance rhetorically all he wants. The paper trail convicts him. But in the moment, watching Jackson struggle, the trial seems vulnerable. It looks like Victor's justice failing, like the architect of genocide might actually talk his way into a hung jury or acquittal on some counts. The British prosecutor, Sir Hartley Shawcross, observes Jackson's struggles and prepares a different approach. When it's Britain's turn to cross-examine, Shawcross doesn't try to engage Göring in debate. He presents documents, asks for confirmation, and moves on. He doesn't give Göring room to speechify. Shawcross: This document bears your signature. Do you confirm it's authentic? Göring: Yes, but... Shawcross: Thank you. Next document. It's less dramatic than Jackson's approach, but more effective. Shawcross isn't trying to make Göring admit guilt. He's just building a documentary record that speaks for itself. The French and Soviet prosecutors present their cases. The French focus on crimes committed during the occupation of France. The Soviets present evidence of atrocities on the Eastern Front. Soviet prosecutor Rudenko confronts Göring with evidence of the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads that followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union and systematically murdered Jews, Roma, and communist officials. Rudenko. You were aware that these units were operating behind military lines? Göring. I knew that security operations were conducted in occupied territories. Rudenko. Security operations. These units murdered over 1 million civilians. Their daily reports document each massacre. Göring. I didn't receive such reports. That was SS activity, not Luftwaffe or government administration. Rudenko presents a document, a report circulated to senior Nazi leadership summarizing Einsatzgruppen activities, including kill statistics. Göring's office is listed as a recipient. Göring. My office received thousands of documents. I can't personally attest to reading each one. It's a weak defense, but it creates enough plausible deniability that Göring can maintain his narrative. He was a political leader focused on military and economic matters, unaware of extermination programs run by Himmler and the SS. The evidence mounts. The prosecution moves forward with its case. As the prosecution's case continues through the spring and summer of 1946, more evidence emerges. Some of it creates new complications. The Soviet prosecution presents evidence of the Katyn Forest massacre, the execution of more than 20,000 Polish officers in 1940. The Soviets claim the Germans did it. The Germans claim the Soviets did it. In fact, the Soviets did it. Stalin ordered the execution in 1940 before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and then blamed the Germans when mass graves were discovered in 1943. The Soviet prosecutor is presenting evidence of a Soviet crime and attributing it to Germany in an international court of law. The German defense attorneys know this. They present evidence. The type of ammunition used matches Soviet weapons, not German. The dating of the bodies matches the period when the Soviets controlled the area, not the later German occupation. Witnesses testify that German forces discovered the graves already filled. The Soviet prosecutor dismisses this as Nazi propaganda. He insists the Germans committed the massacre and fabricated evidence to blame the Soviets. The judges are in an impossible position. The evidence suggests the Soviets are responsible, but formally accusing a member nation of the tribunal would fracture the Allied coalition and potentially collapse the trial. The judges quietly decline to rule on Katyn. They move past it without resolving the question. The final verdict makes no finding about who committed the massacre. This is what Victor's justice looks like in practice, not fabricating evidence or rigging verdicts, but selectively examining which crimes get prosecuted and which get ignored for political expediency. Other evidence is harder to dismiss or rationalize. The prosecution calls concentration camp survivors who testify about conditions, selections, executions. They call Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who calmly describes the industrial process of mass murder. Höss is not a defendant at the main Nuremberg trial. He'll be tried separately and executed in 1947, but he's called as a prosecution witness. He testifies in a flat, bureaucratic tone, describing Auschwitz as if he's reporting on factory production. Höss testifies that approximately 2.5 million people were killed at Auschwitz during his tenure as commandant. Most were Jews transported from across Europe. The killing process was systematized. Trains arrived at the camp, prisoners were selected for immediate death or labor. Those selected for death were sent to gas chambers disguised as showers, their bodies were cremated, and their belongings were sorted for economic exploitation. He describes technical details, the capacity of the gas chambers, the time required for Zyklon B to kill, the cremation process, the disposal of ashes. The courtroom listens in horrified silence. Even the defendants look disturbed, though whether from the testimony itself or from Höss's willingness to describe it so clinically is unclear. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys try to undermine Höss's testimony. They ask whether he was tortured by Allied interrogators. Höss admits he was beaten during initial interrogation, but insists his testimony is accurate. They ask whether his estimates might be exaggerated. Höss responds, "I kept detailed records. The numbers are precise." The prosecution presents those records, daily reports from Auschwitz showing arrivals, selections, and deaths. The bureaucracy of genocide, documented in official forms. The prosecution presents the Wannsee Conference minutes, the document from a meeting on January 20th, 1942, where Nazi officials coordinated the final solution to the Jewish question. The minutes are extraordinary. They're written in bureaucratic language using euphemisms, but the meaning is clear. 15 Nazi officials met at a villa on the Wannsee Lake in Berlin to coordinate the deportation and extermination of 11 million European Jews. The document discusses transportation logistics, how to move Jews from across Europe to extermination centers in occupied Poland. It discusses legal definitions, who counts as Jewish under Nazi racial law. It discusses labor exploitation, using Jews capable of work for forced labor until they die, then killing the survivors. The minutes don't use the word kill. They use terms like evacuation, resettlement, and special treatment, but the context makes the meaning unmistakable. The prosecution introduces the document and reads it aloud. The courtroom listens as Nazi officials discuss genocide in the language of administrative planning. Defense attorneys scramble. Some defendants claim ignorance. They didn't know about the extermination program. The Wannsee minutes prove that senior officials across multiple agencies knew and coordinated. Others claim they opposed it but had no power to stop it. Documents prove they participated in implementation. Others claim they were following Hitler's orders. Jackson responds that following illegal orders doesn't absolve criminal responsibility. The tribunal is establishing a new principle. Individuals are responsible for their choices, even when acting as state agents. The only strategy that shows any promise is the one Albert Speer attempts: partial admission of guilt coupled with claims of ignorance about the worst crimes. Speer testifies in June. He's calm, articulate, and strategic. He admits that he bears responsibility for using slave labor in armaments production. He admits he should have questioned Hitler's orders more forcefully. He says he was focused on production targets and willfully blind to the suffering required to meet them. He expresses something resembling remorse. "I was so absorbed in my work that I failed to see the larger moral implications," Speer testifies. "I understand now that I was complicit in terrible crimes. I should have known. I should have resisted. I failed in my duty as a human being." It's a calculated performance. Speer gives the court just enough contrition to seem redeemable while maintaining just enough deniability to avoid a death sentence. What Speer doesn't admit, that he knew about the extermination program, that he visited concentration camps and selected prisoners for forced labor, that he personally proposed using concentration camp inmates in armaments factories, that he participated in planning to destroy German infrastructure as Allied forces advanced, which would have caused mass civilian starvation. Speer's testimony is carefully constructed to position himself as the apolitical technocrat, the architect, and manager who got caught up in something larger than himself. He expresses regret without admitting full knowledge of genocidal crimes. The prosecutors challenge him, but Speer maintains his position. He admits enough to seem honest, denies enough to preserve some moral distance from the worst atrocities. It works, sort of. Speer will be convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, avoiding the death penalty. He'll serve the full term in Spandau prison and be released in 1966. He'll write memoirs that reinforce his narrative of the remorseful technocrat, and only decades later will historians uncover documents proving he lied about nearly everything. He knew about the extermination camps, visited them, actively participated in slave labor exploitation, and showed no genuine remorse at the time. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In August of 1946, the evidence phase of the trial concludes, and the defendants are allowed to make final statements. The final statements reveal the defendants' varying psychological states and strategies. Some are defiant, some are evasive, some show cracks in their carefully maintained composure. Julius Streicher, the publisher of the viciously anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, stands and shouts, "The Bolsheviks will hang you one day. Purim Fest 1946. He's referencing the Jewish holiday celebrating deliverance from genocide, essentially admitting the Holocaust while framing it as justified resistance to Jewish power. He concludes, "Heil Hitler." The judges have Streicher removed from the courtroom. His final statement is struck from the record. He's brought back later, subdued but unrepentant. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, delivers a rambling statement claiming he was just a diplomat following orders. He insists he worked for peace, that he didn't know about concentration camps, that he was focused on international relations. It's a weak defense, contradicted by extensive documentary evidence of his participation in planning aggressive war and coordinating deportations. Wilhelm Keitel, the military commander, stands at attention and delivers a soldier's defense. "I believed in the oath of loyalty to my supreme commander. I followed orders. I believed I was serving my country. If that is a crime, then I am guilty. But I was a soldier doing my duty." It's the clearest articulation of the superior orders defense. The tribunal will reject it, establishing that following illegal orders doesn't absolve individual responsibility. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the SS leader, denies everything. He claims he was nominally in charge of the concentration camp system, but had no actual authority. He insists he didn't know about extermination programs. He maintains this despite documents proving he visited camps, received reports, and authorized killings. His denial is so comprehensive and so contradicted by evidence that it undermines any sympathy he might have generated. Alfred Rosenberg, the racial theorist, delivers an ideological defense. He maintains that his writings about Aryan racial superiority and Jewish racial inferiority were theoretical, not calls for violence. He frames himself as a philosopher whose ideas were misapplied by others. The prosecution has already demonstrated that Rosenberg served as minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, where he oversaw systematic plunder and mass murder. His claim to be merely a theorist is laughable. Hans Frank is different. Frank was the Governor-General of occupied Poland. His territory included the Warsaw Ghetto and the concentration camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. He oversaw the systematic destruction of Polish Jewry. He kept a detailed diary, 38 volumes, documenting his actions. The diary was captured by Allied forces. It was used as evidence against him. It proved his knowledge of and participation in mass murder. Entries describe policies of deliberate starvation, mass executions, and deportations to death camps. In his final statement, Frank says, "1,000 years will pass and the guilt of Germany will not be erased. I have carried the guilt with me in the dock. I beg our people not to continue in this direction, not one step further." And he seems to be having a psychological or spiritual breakdown. Some interpret it as genuine moral reckoning, others see it as performance. The prison chaplain later reports that Frank converted to Catholicism while awaiting verdict and expressed remorse for his crimes. Whether Frank's contrition is genuine or strategic is unclear. What's clear is that his diary provided some of the most damning evidence at the trial. He documented his own participation in genocide and brought those documents to Nuremberg. Göring delivers the final statement for the defense. He speaks for 30 minutes. He defends Hitler as a great leader who restored German pride. He justifies aggressive war as defensive necessity. He frames the trial as political theatre, victor's vengeance disguised as legal process. "I had the good fortune to work for the greatest man ever born in the German nation," Göring says. "I regret nothing. I would do it all again. History will judge us. And history will understand that we fought for Germany's survival against hostile powers determined to destroy us. It's defiant, unapologetic, and completely unrepentant. Göring has decided to go down fighting, defending Nazi Germany to the end. The judges retire to deliberate. They have thousands of pages of testimony, documentary evidence, and legal arguments to consider. They must determine individual guilt, assign appropriate sentences, and create legal precedent for international criminal law. The deliberations are contentious. The judges from different nations have different legal traditions and political pressures. The Soviet judge pushes for maximum sentences across the board. The French judge is more focused on establishing legal principles. The American and British judges try to balance justice with precedent setting. They take a month. On September 30th and October 1st, 1946, the judges return to deliver verdicts. The courtroom is packed. Every seat is filled. Journalists crowd the press gallery. The defendants sit in the dock, guarded as always, awaiting judgment. Lord Justice Lawrence reads the verdicts. Each defendant is called individually. The defendant stands, the verdict is read, the sentence is pronounced, the defendant sits. Hermann Göring is called first. Lawrence, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Göring shows no reaction. He sits down calmly. He's been expecting this. Joachim von Ribbentrop, guilty on all counts. Sentence, death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, guilty on all counts. Death. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, guilty on counts 3 and 4. Death. Alfred Rosenberg, guilty on all counts. Death. Hans Frank, guilty on counts 3 and 4. Death. Julius Streicher, guilty on count 4. Death. The verdicts proceed down the list. Of the 21 defendants, 12 are sentenced to death by hanging, 3 are sentenced to life imprisonment, 4 receive prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years, and 3 are acquitted. Hjalmar Schacht, the former economics minister who broke with the Nazis before the war. The tribunal finds that while Schacht participated in rearmament, he did not participate in planning aggressive war or crimes against humanity. Franz von Papen, the former vice-chancellor. The tribunal finds insufficient evidence of criminal activity. Hans Fritzsche, a radio propagandist. Fritzsche was essentially a substitute for Goebbels, who was dead. The tribunal finds that while Fritzsche spread propaganda, he didn't participate in criminal planning. The acquittals are crucial. They demonstrate that the trial involved genuine deliberation, that the outcome wasn't predetermined, that the tribunal at least attempted to weigh evidence fairly. They also infuriate the Soviets. Nikitchenko, the Soviet judge, issues a dissenting opinion, arguing that Schacht, von Papen, and Fritzsche should have been convicted. He also argues for harsher sentences across the board. Everyone should receive death except a few who should receive life imprisonment. But the verdicts stand. And on October 16, 1946, 10 men are scheduled to hang. 12 were sentenced to death, but Göring will not make it to the gallows, and Martin Bormann was tried in absentia and remains missing. On the night of October 15th, Hermann Göring is in his cell at Nuremberg prison. The cells are under 24-hour observation. Guards watch the prisoners through peepholes every few minutes. The security is maximum level. These are the most important prisoners in Allied custody. Göring is scheduled to hang the next morning at 1 a.m. He's written farewell letters to his wife and daughter. He's requested that his body be sent to his family for burial. The request has been denied. The Allies are concerned about creating a shrine for neo-Nazis. Göring seems calm throughout the evening. He speaks briefly with the guards. He reads. He lies down on his cot around 10 p.m. At some point between 10 p.m. and 10:45 p.m., Zetiam Göring bites down on a cyanide capsule. By the time guards check on him at 10:50 p.m., E. He's dead. The discovery triggers immediate chaos. Guards rush into the cell. A doctor is called. Goering is declared dead. The prison commandant is notified. American military authorities launch an immediate investigation. The cyanide raises immediate questions. How did Goering get it? He was searched multiple times when first captured in May 1945. His belongings were examined. His clothing was inspected. He was strip-searched. The capsule should have been found. The investigation produces multiple theories, but no definitive answer. Theory 1, Goering hid the capsule in his luggage and it wasn't discovered during searches. Possible, but unlikely. His luggage was thoroughly examined. Theory 2, Goering's wife smuggled the capsule to him during a final visit. Possible, but she was searched before and after the visit. Theory 3, a sympathetic guard delivered the capsule to Goering. This becomes the subject of intense investigation. Every guard who had contact with Goering is interrogated. No evidence of bribery or sympathy emerges. Theory 4. Goering hid the capsule in a body cavity from the moment of capture and retrieved it when execution became certain. This is the most likely explanation. Goering was strip-searched, but a capsule hidden in a body cavity could evade detection if the search wasn't invasive. When the execution date was set, Goering could have retrieved the capsule and hidden it in his cell until the opportune moment. The investigation never produces a definitive answer. The guards responsible for observing Goering are reprimanded but not prosecuted. The American military is embarrassed but determined to proceed with the remaining executions. Goering leaves a final letter addressed to the tribunal. It's discovered in his cell. In it he writes, "I would have consented to be shot. However, I will not facilitate the execution of Germany's Reichsmarshal by hanging. For the sake of Germany, I cannot permit this. I have no moral obligation to submit to the justice of my enemies." It's a final act of defiance. Goering has denied the Allies the satisfaction of executing him. He's controlled his death as he tried to control the trial, on his terms. On the morning of October 16th, 1946, 10 men are hanged in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. The gymnasium has been converted into an execution chamber. 3 gallows are constructed, portable scaffolds that can execute one prisoner at a time. The design is American military standard, a platform with a trapdoor, a noose, and a drop calculated to break the neck. The executioner is U.S. Master Sergeant John C. Woods. Woods is the official U.S. military executioner responsible for performing executions of convicted war criminals. He's conducted more than 300 executions by hanging. The executions are scheduled to begin at 1 a.m. They're conducted in the middle of the night for security reasons, to prevent demonstrations or rescue attempts. Witnesses include Allied officers, journalists, and official observers. The condemned men are brought from their cells one at a time, executed, and their bodies removed before the next prisoner is brought in. The hangings do not go smoothly. The drop mechanism is improvised. The scaffolds were constructed quickly. The calculations for drop distance, which determines whether death is instantaneous from a broken neck or slow from strangulation, are imprecise. Joachim von Ribbentrop is first. He's brought into the gymnasium at 1:11 a.m. He's pale, trembling. He makes a brief statement. "My last wish is that Germany realize its entity and that understanding between East and West may be realized. I wish peace for the world." He's positioned on the trapdoor. The noose is placed around his neck. The trap is sprung. Ribbentrop drops. He doesn't die instantly. The drop distance is too short. His neck doesn't break. He strangles slowly. It takes 14 minutes for him to die. Wilhelm Keitel is next. He walks to the gallows with a military bearing, shoulders back. He calls out Deutschland über alles, Germany above all, as the trap is sprung. His death is quicker than Ribbentrop's, but still not instantaneous. Ernst Kaltenbrunner is third. The noose is too tight. When the trap opens, he strikes his head on the edge of the trapdoor. He's semi-conscious, strangling and bleeding. It's grotesque. Alfred Rosenberg makes no final statement. He's executed at 2:29 a.m. Hans Frank speaks briefly. "I am thankful for the kind treatment during my captivity, and I ask God to accept me with mercy." He's executed at 2:46 a.m. The executions continue. Wilhelm Frick, Fritz Saukel, Alfred Jodl, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Julius Streicher is last. He's brought in at 2:55 a.m. He's agitated, shouting. As he's positioned on the trapdoor, he screams, "Heil Hitler and Purim Fest 1946!" He continues shouting until the trap is sprung. By 3:45 a.m., all 10 men are dead. Their bodies are photographed as proof of execution. The photographs show each body hanging from the noose, face visible, eyes closed or half open. The images are graphic, official, and classified for decades. The bodies are removed from the nooses and placed in simple wooden coffins. They're cremated later that morning at a crematorium in Munich. The ashes are scattered in a tributary of the Isar River, so no grave site can become a shrine for neo-Nazis. The executions are not publicized in detail immediately. The Allied authorities release a statement confirming the executions were carried out. Journalists who witnessed the hangings file reports describing the scene. The photographs remain classified. The remaining imprisoned defendants begin serving their sentences. Rudolf Hess, sentenced to life, is transferred to Spandau Prison in Berlin. He'll remain there until his death in 1987, the last prisoner, alone in a massive facility designed for hundreds. Albert Speer serves his 20-year sentence in Spandau. He's released in 1966 and immediately begins writing memoirs. His books, Inside the Third Reich and Spandau, The Secret Diaries, become international bestsellers. Speer portrays himself as the remorseful technocrat who was seduced by Hitler, but never truly understood the evil he served. Historians later prove most of his claims are false. Karl Dönitz serves his 10-year sentence. He's released in 1956 and dies in 1980. The 3 acquitted defendants, Schacht, von Papen, and Fritzsche, are released from custody but immediately arrested by German denazification authorities. They face additional proceedings in German courts. Schacht is eventually cleared. Von Papen is convicted of lesser offences and serves a brief sentence. Fritzsche is acquitted in German proceedings and dies in poverty in 1953. The tribunal closes. The courtroom is dismantled. The Palace of Justice returns to being a regular German courthouse. And the question remains, did it work? Did the Nuremberg trial accomplish what Henry Stimson hoped? Document Nazi crimes, establish legal precedent, demonstrate that individuals are accountable for atrocities committed in the name of the state? The answer is complicated. Legally, Nuremberg created the foundation for international criminal law. The United Nations International Law Commission codified the Nuremberg Principles in 1950. The principles state that individuals can be held criminally responsible for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. That superior orders is not a defense if the person knew the orders were illegal. That everyone is entitled to a fair trial, even for the worst crimes. These principles informed the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which updated the laws of war to address lessons from World War II. They became the basis for the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia in 1993, prosecuting atrocities from the Balkan Wars. They informed the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1994, prosecuting the Rwandan genocide. They led to the permanent International Criminal Court established in 2002. Every modern prosecution of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes traces its legal lineage back to Nuremberg. Historically, the trial created an undeniable documentary record. The Nazi regime's own documents, introduced as evidence and preserved in the trial record, make Holocaust denial effectively impossible for anyone engaging with evidence in good faith. The systematic nature of the genocide, the bureaucratic organization of mass murder, the explicit planning documented in meeting minutes, all of this became part of the permanent historical record because of the trial. But politically, the trial's legacy is more ambiguous. Many lower-level perpetrators were never prosecuted. The subsequent Nuremberg trials, held between 1946 and 1949, prosecuted doctors who conducted medical experiments, judges who implemented Nazi legal theories, industrialists who profited from slave labor, and military leaders who committed war crimes. But thousands of SS members, concentration camp guards, Gestapo officers, and bureaucrats who facilitated genocide escaped prosecution entirely. Some fled to South America. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the deportation system, escaped to Argentina and lived under an assumed name until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor who conducted horrific experiments on prisoners, died in Brazil in 1979 without ever facing trial. Others were recruited by Allied powers during the Cold War. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to the United States to work on rockets and weapons programs. Werner von Braun, who used slave labor to build V-2 rockets at the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, became the father of the American space program and a national hero. The Soviets recruited their own German scientists and engineers. Both sides prioritized Cold War competition over comprehensive denazification. West Germany's reconstruction meant many former Nazis returned to positions of authority. Police forces, judiciaries, business sectors, and government agencies were staffed by men who had served the Third Reich. Some had been party members, but not war criminals. Others had committed atrocities that were never investigated. The trial itself, as theatre, had mixed effects on the German public. Some saw it as legitimate justice. Others saw it as victor's punishment. The occupying powers' attempts to use the trial for denazification were complicated by Germans' own psychological need to move past the war and rebuild their country. And the Cold War quickly overshadowed the trial's lessons. By the early 1950s, West Germany was being rearmed as a bulwark against Soviet communism. The United States and Britain were more concerned with Soviet expansion than continued pursuit of Nazi criminals. Many convicted war criminals had their sentences reduced or were released early for political reasons. So did Nuremberg succeed? Depends on what you measure. As a legal proceeding, it was revolutionary. It created law where none existed. It established that sovereignty doesn't protect individuals from accountability for crimes against humanity. It rejected the defense of superior orders. It proved that international criminal trials are possible. As historical documentation, it was essential. The trial preserved evidence and testimony that might otherwise have been lost or disputed. It created an authoritative record of Nazi crimes that has educated generations. As immediate justice, it was incomplete. The men who faced trial were a fraction of those responsible. The executions and prison sentences didn't restore victims or prevent future atrocities. The trial couldn't undo the murder of 6 million Jews, millions of Soviet civilians, hundreds of thousands of Roma, political prisoners, disabled people, homosexuals, and prisoners of war. As symbolic reckoning, it was both powerful and flawed. Powerful because it demonstrated that even in the aftermath of total war, law can prevail over revenge. Flawed because the Allied powers' own war crimes, the strategic bombing of civilian populations, the Soviet Union's aggression and atrocities, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were never examined with the same rigor. The trial's greatest achievement may be its precedent, not the specific convictions or sentences, but the principle that individual human beings are responsible for their choices, even when acting as agents of a state. That "I was following orders" doesn't absolve moral or legal guilt. That crimes against humanity can be prosecuted internationally. These principles have been invoked in every major human rights prosecution since. When Serbian leaders faced trial for ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, when Rwandan genocidaires were prosecuted for mass murder, when Charles Taylor of Liberia was convicted of war crimes, when international prosecutors investigate atrocities in Syria, Myanmar, or Sudan. The language comes from Nuremberg. The legal framework comes from Nuremberg. The aspiration that justice can extend beyond national borders comes from Nuremberg, but so do the limitations. The International Criminal Court has been criticized as toothless because powerful nations refuse to submit to its jurisdiction. The United States, Russia, and China are not party to the Rome Statute that created the ICC. The court has disproportionately prosecuted African leaders, while perpetrators from powerful nations escape scrutiny. Victor's justice, in other words, remains a problem. International criminal law still struggles with the question of who prosecutes the prosecutors. When American forces commit war crimes in Iraq or Afghanistan, who holds them accountable? When Russian forces commit atrocities in Chechnya or Ukraine, what mechanism exists for prosecution? When Chinese authorities commit human rights violations against Uyghurs, what court has jurisdiction? The Nuremberg trial didn't solve these problems. It couldn't. It was convened by victorious powers prosecuting defeated enemies. It was always going to be limited by that origin. What it did do was establish that such prosecution is possible, that individuals can face criminal liability for atrocities, that evidence and legal process can substitute for summary execution, that even the worst crimes can be addressed through law rather than vengeance. And it created a documentary record that preserves the truth when memory fades and denial emerges. Because here's what happened in the decades after Nuremberg: denial. Holocaust denial became a marginal but persistent phenomenon. People who refused to accept the documented evidence of genocide created elaborate conspiracy theories to explain away the trial, the documents, the testimony, the physical evidence. The Nuremberg Trials documentary record became the primary defense against this denial. When deniers claimed the Holocaust was exaggerated, historians pointed to the Nazi documents admitted as evidence at Nuremberg. When deniers claimed concentration camps were labor facilities, not death camps, historians pointed to Rudolf Höss's testimony describing the killing process at Auschwitz. When deniers claimed Allied prosecutors fabricated evidence, historians noted that the documents were captured Nazi records, authenticated through chain of custody and cross-examination. The trial created what one historian called a paper trail to Auschwitz. The bureaucratic documentation of genocide, preserved and authenticated through the legal process, made denial intellectually unsustainable for anyone engaging honestly with evidence. This matters because collective memory is fragile. Survivors die. Documents decay. Oral histories become contested. Without institutional mechanisms for preserving evidence and establishing authoritative historical record, atrocities can be minimized, denied, or forgotten within generations. The Nuremberg trial was such a mechanism. It transformed eyewitness accounts and captured documents into legal evidence, cross-examined in adversarial proceedings, judged by an international tribunal, preserved in official records. That's the trial's most lasting achievement. Not the executions, not even the legal precedent, but the creation of an irrefutable historical record that documents what happened, who was responsible, and why it cannot be allowed to happen again. Let me tell you about the last survivor. His name was Ben Ferenc. He was born in Transylvania, immigrated to America as a child, became a lawyer, and joined the US Army during World War II. After the war, he was assigned to investigate Nazi war crimes. He entered concentration camps shortly after liberation. He collected evidence from mass graves. He interrogated SS officers. In 1947, at age 27, he became the chief prosecutor in one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, the Einsatzgruppen trial. He prosecuted 22 SS officers who led mobile killing squads that murdered more than 1 million people in Eastern Europe. Ferenc didn't have the resources that Jackson's team had. He was given a small staff and told to prepare the case in months, but he had something powerful: the Einsatzgruppen's own reports. The mobile killing squads documented their actions in daily situation reports sent to Berlin. The reports were bureaucratic, clinical. Today, 500 Jews liquidated in Kovno, weekly total 7, 8 and 19 Jews, 192 Roma, 8 commissars executed. Ferenc presented these reports as evidence. The SS officers had documented their own crimes, reported them to superiors, and those reports were captured by Allied forces. All 22 defendants were convicted. 13 were sentenced to death, though only 4 were eventually executed. The others had their sentences commuted during the Cold War, when West Germany was being rearmed and political priorities shifted. Ferenc spent the rest of his life advocating for international criminal law. He helped establish the International Criminal Court. He gave lectures about Nuremberg's legacy. He insisted that the trial's principles, individual accountability, rejection of superior orders, universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity, must be applied universally or they mean nothing. He died in April of 2023 at age 103. In his final interviews, he said the same thing he'd been saying for 70 years: law not war, law not war. That was Nuremberg's promise. Not that it perfectly delivered justice, it didn't. Not that it prosecuted everyone responsible, it couldn't. But that it established the principle that law could address even the worst crimes humanity commits. The alternative was the path Churchill advocated: summary execution without trial. Swift, efficient, final. Göring and the others would have been shot in May of 1945, and the world would have moved on. What would have been lost? The documentary evidence presented in open court would have remained classified military intelligence. The legal precedent for prosecuting crimes against humanity would not exist. The survivor testimony would have been scattered oral accounts rather than sworn testimony in legal proceedings. The principle of individual accountability would have remained abstract rather than demonstrated through specific convictions. And the Nazis themselves would have been denied the opportunity to confront the evidence of their crimes. That confrontation mattered, not because it produced widespread remorse, it didn't, but because it made denial impossible. The defendants couldn't claim ignorance when prosecutors presented documents they had signed. They couldn't claim they were just following orders when judges ruled that illegal orders don't absolve responsibility. The trial forced a reckoning. Not a complete reckoning, not a perfect reckoning, but a documented public legal reckoning that created a permanent record. That record survives. The transcripts are available online. The entire Nuremberg trial record has been digitized and is publicly accessible. The documentary evidence is preserved in archives, the National Archives, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem in Israel. Historians continue to study the proceedings, uncovering new insights about how the trial shaped international law and historical memory. And when new atrocities occur, and they do continuously across the world, prosecutors and human rights advocates invoke Nuremberg as the precedent that makes prosecution possible. Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Sudan. The International Criminal Court and ad hoc tribunals draw directly on Nuremberg's framework. They cite the Nuremberg principles, they use similar evidentiary standards, they structure charges around crimes against humanity. They also face similar criticisms, that they're instruments of powerful nations, that they selectively prosecute based on politics, that they deliver incomplete justice. All of which is true. International criminal law remains imperfect, politically constrained, and inadequately enforced. But it exists. That's Nuremberg's legacy. The trial didn't end impunity. It didn't prevent future genocides. It didn't create a world where human rights are universally respected, but it established that impunity can be challenged, that genocide can be prosecuted, that human rights violations have legal consequences even for heads of state and military commanders. It created the possibility of accountability, not the guarantee, the possibility. And that possibility emerged from a decision made in the summer of 1945 by a 78-year-old American bureaucrat who believed that how you punish the guilty matters as much as whether you punish them. Henry Stimson never saw the execution of the sentences. He retired before the verdicts were delivered. But his insistence on legal process rather than summary execution created the template for every human rights prosecution that followed. Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor, returned to the Supreme Court after the trial. He continued to cite Nuremberg as evidence that law can evolve to address new categories of crime. His opening statement remains one of the defining texts of international criminal law. Legal scholars still quote it, prosecutors still reference it. The principle that power must pay tribute to reason continues to inform how we think about justice after atrocity. The defendants who survived prison were released and largely disappeared from public life. Albert Speer wrote memoirs that sold millions of copies and reinforced his narrative as the apolitical technocrat. Historians spent decades dismantling his lies, revealing that he was fully aware of concentration camps, used slave labor extensively, and showed no genuine remorse. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg still functions as a courthouse. Part of it is now a museum dedicated to the trial, Memoriam Nuremberg Trials. You can visit the courtroom where the proceedings occurred. It looks smaller than you'd expect. The judge's bench, the defendant's dock, the prosecution tables, all preserved. Tour guides explain the trial's significance. School groups learn about international law. Tourists take photos in the courtroom where Hermann Göring was convicted and Julius Streicher shouted, "Heil Hitler!" and Hans Frank acknowledged that 1,000 years wouldn't erase Germany's guilt. The trial is history now. The participants are dead. The survivors are gone. What remains is precedent, documentation, and the ongoing question of how law addresses atrocity. Because here's what Nuremberg didn't resolve: the fundamental tension between justice and politics in international law. The trial was political. It had to be. It was organized by victorious powers, prosecuted defeated enemies, and carefully avoided examining Allied conduct. The Soviet judge had participated in Stalin's show trials. The Katyn massacre was blamed on Germany when the Soviets were responsible. Churchill wanted summary execution. Stalin wanted show trials. The fact that the trial nonetheless produced genuine legal proceedings, acquittals, and lasting precedent is remarkable, but it doesn't eliminate the political nature of international prosecution. Every international tribunal since Nuremberg has faced the same challenge. How do you create impartial justice when prosecution depends on the political will of powerful nations? How do you prosecute human rights violations when those same powerful nations commit violations? The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction only over nations that accept its authority. The United States, Russia, and China refuse, which means that American soldiers accused of war crimes in Afghanistan, Russian commanders accused of atrocities in Ukraine, and Chinese officials accused of genocide against Uyghurs face no realistic prospect of ICC prosecution. Meanwhile, the court has focused heavily on prosecuting African leaders from Uganda, Sudan, Kenya, Libya, Côte d'Ivoire, which feeds the criticism that it's an instrument of Western power rather than impartial justice. This is the Nuremberg paradox. The trial established that individuals can be held accountable for crimes against humanity. But accountability still depends on power: who has it, who wields it, who faces prosecution, and who doesn't. Nuremberg didn't solve this problem because it couldn't. The trial itself was an exercise in victor's justice. The fact that it produced something more than victor's vengeance was an achievement, but it didn't transcend the power dynamics that made prosecution possible. Which brings us back to the question, did it work? If the goal was perfect justice, no. Too many perpetrators escaped. The Allied powers' own crimes went unexamined. The sentences were inconsistent. The early releases during the Cold War undermined the severity of convictions. If the goal was comprehensive denazification, no. Thousands of Nazi Party members returned to positions of authority in post-war Germany. War criminals fled to South America and lived unmolested for decades. The Cold War's political priorities superseded continued prosecution. If the goal was preventing future atrocities, no. Genocide continued after Nuremberg, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Myanmar. The trial didn't prevent humanity from repeating the crimes it condemned. But if the goal was establishing that even the worst crimes can be addressed through law rather than summary vengeance, that individuals are accountable for their choices, that sovereignty doesn't protect perpetrators from prosecution, then yes, it worked. It created precedent where none existed. It documented crimes that might otherwise have been denied. It demonstrated that legal process can survive even total war. It established principles that continue to inform human rights law and prosecution of atrocities. The Nuremberg trial didn't end impunity, but it made impunity harder to maintain. It created a legal framework that allows for prosecution even when political will is lacking. It provided a model that subsequent tribunals could adapt and improve, and it preserved the truth. That's not nothing. In an era of denial, disinformation, and selective memory, having an authoritative, documented, legally validated record of historical truth matters. The Nuremberg trial created such a record. The Nazi regime's own documents, admitted as evidence and preserved in legal archives, make Holocaust denial intellectually untenable for anyone engaging with evidence in good faith. The trial didn't end denial, denial continues, but it created an evidentiary foundation that makes denial's falsity demonstrable. That foundation has educated generations. Students studying the Holocaust read Nuremberg testimony. Historians researching Nazi Germany analyze Nuremberg documents. Legal scholars developing international criminal law cite Nuremberg precedents. The trial became part of how we understand history, law, and morality in the aftermath of atrocity. It's not the final word on any of those subjects, but it's an essential part of the ongoing conversation about accountability, justice, and human rights, which is perhaps all we can reasonably ask of a legal proceeding conducted in the ruins of civilization by imperfect people representing imperfect nations attempting to create law from first principles while the world watched. The Nuremberg trial was flawed. It was politically constrained. It delivered incomplete justice. It failed to prosecute many perpetrators. It avoided examining allied crimes. It created precedent that powerful nations continue to ignore when convenient. And it still mattered. Because Henry Stimson was right, how you punish the guilty matters as much as whether you punish them. Creating a documented legal public record of atrocity serves purposes beyond immediate justice. It educates future generations. It establishes precedent for future prosecution. It preserves truth against denial. The alternative, summary execution, would have been swifter, simpler, and arguably more satisfying in the moment. but it would have left no record, no precedent, no framework for future accountability. The decision to hold a trial rather than conduct executions was a gamble. It risked creating a platform for Nazi propaganda. It risked acquittals that would have undermined Allied credibility. It risked exposing the hypocrisy of Allied conduct. But it created something that outlasted the trial itself, the principle that law can address even the worst crimes humanity commits. That individuals are accountable for their choices, that following orders doesn't absolve responsibility, that crimes against humanity can be prosecuted regardless of where they occur or who commits them. These principles remain contested, their application remains uneven, but they exist. They inform international law. They enable prosecution of atrocities. They allow for accountability when political will exists to pursue it. That's Nuremberg's legacy. Not the specific convictions or sentences, but the establishment of a legal framework that continues to evolve and expand in response to new atrocities. The trial didn't create a just world, it created the possibility of justice in an unjust world, which is perhaps the most we can ask of law. The men who designed the trial, Stimson, Jackson, the Allied negotiators who drafted the London Charter, understood they were creating precedent for a world they wouldn't live to see. They knew the trial was imperfect. They knew it would face criticism. They knew powerful nations would ignore its principles when convenient. They proceeded anyway, because the alternative was worse. Because summary vengeance would have been immediately satisfying but historically empty. Because creating law in the aftermath of atrocity, even flawed and politically constrained law, was better than abandoning the attempt at legal accountability. 78 years after the Nuremberg verdicts, we're still living with that choice, still debating its legacy, still wrestling with the same tensions between justice and politics, between idealism and pragmatism, between holding perpetrators accountable and accommodating the political realities that make prosecution possible. The trial didn't resolve those tensions, it made them visible. It created a framework for addressing them. It established that law has a role in responding to atrocity, even when that role is limited, imperfect, and politically constrained. That's not the triumphant narrative you learned in school. It's not a story of unambiguous good conquering absolute evil. It's a story of imperfect people in an imperfect system attempting to create accountability in the aftermath of unprecedented crime. They succeeded partially. The men executed on October 16, 1946, were guilty. The men imprisoned were guilty. The men acquitted may or may not have been less guilty, but the fact that acquittals happened demonstrated that the trial involved genuine deliberation rather than predetermined outcomes. The many perpetrators who escaped prosecution remained guilty regardless of whether they faced trial. The Allied powers' own crimes remained crimes regardless of whether they were examined with the same rigor as Nazi atrocities. Justice was incomplete. But it was something, and the precedent established at Nuremberg continues to inform how the international community responds to atrocity. When prosecutors investigate war crimes in Ukraine, they cite Nuremberg principles. When human rights advocates document crimes against humanity in Myanmar, they reference Nuremberg's framework. When the International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for heads of state, it invokes Nuremberg's rejection of sovereign immunity for perpetrators of atrocities. The trial's influence persists not because it was perfect, but because it established that legal accountability is possible even for the worst crimes. That documentation matters. That evidence can substitute for vengeance. That law can evolve to address new categories of crime. These principles remain under assault. Powerful nations still claim immunity from prosecution. Political considerations still determine who faces trial and who doesn't. Genocide still occurs without perpetrators facing consequences. But the framework exists. The precedent is established. The possibility of accountability, however imperfectly realized, continues to exist because of a trial conducted in a damaged courthouse in a ruined German city in the immediate aftermath of history's most destructive war. That trial didn't deliver perfect justice. It couldn't. Perfect justice may not be possible in response to atrocity of this magnitude, but it delivered something: documentation, precedent, and a framework for future accountability. Which means Henry Stimson's gamble paid off. The trial he insisted on holding, despite Churchill's objections and Stalin's preferences for show trials, created lasting value beyond the immediate verdicts and sentences. It established that law matters even when power determines outcomes. That documentation serves purposes beyond immediate prosecution. That creating precedent for future accountability justifies the messy, compromised, politically constrained proceedings necessary to establish that precedent. The Nuremberg trial was the day evil faced justice, not perfect justice, not complete justice, but justice nonetheless, a flawed, partial, politically constrained reckoning that somehow created principles that outlasted the trial and continue to inform how humanity responds to its worst crimes. That's the story they don't tell you in school. Not because it's less heroic than the simplified version, but because it's more complicated, because it reveals that justice in the aftermath of atrocity is always incomplete, always compromised, always politically constrained, and still worth pursuing, because the alternative is to let atrocity go unexamined, to execute perpetrators without trial and lose the documentary record, to abandon the attempt at legal accountability because perfect justice is impossible. The architects of the Nuremberg trial chose differently. They pursued imperfect justice, created incomplete accountability, and established flawed precedent. And 78 years later, every prosecution of crimes against humanity traces its legal lineage back to that choice, back to a trial that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did, back to the day evil faced justice and law prevailed, however imperfectly, over vengeance. That's Nuremberg's legacy. Not triumph, but precedent. Not moral clarity, but legal framework. Not the end of impunity, but the beginning of accountability, which is, in the end, what Henry Stimson fought for, what Robert Jackson prosecuted, what the judges of 4 nations attempted to deliver. An imperfect reckoning that created the foundation for every attempt at international criminal justice that followed. The trial didn't solve the problem of how humanity responds to atrocity, but it established that law has a role in that response. That documentation matters. That accountability is possible even when constrained by politics and power. That lesson endures. Imperfect, contested, inadequately enforced, but real. A framework for justice that exists because of a trial conducted in a damaged building in a ruined city by imperfect people representing imperfect nations attempting to create law from the ashes of civilization. The Nuremberg Trials, the day evil faced justice, the day law replaced vengeance, the day that created the possibility, however imperfectly realized, of accountability for humanity's worst crimes. That possibility persists. Fragile, incomplete, politically constrained, but real. A legacy built on flawed foundations that continues to inform how we understand justice, accountability, and the rule of law in response to atrocity, which is the most that any trial, however ambitious, can reasonably achieve, establishing that accountability is possible even when perfect justice is not,